All right, the sixth and final video for this week. As a reminder, this week we have been talking about explicit instruction with a focus on the opening and the I do or modeling portion of the body of explicit instruction. But we're also going to be talking about, as you can see, goals and objectives. And so, just as a reminder, goals are those bigger, those broader, long-term skills that we want our student to learn within the life of the IEP. And then what we do is we take that broad, that big skill, and we break it down into smaller, very measurable and teachable portions or steps, and those are called our objectives. And those objectives lead up to the acquisition of that broader goal. Now, why do we write IEP goals? Well, we've talked about in the past that we write them because they're expected in your program, that you're going to be writing IEP goals for the rest of your time here at the university. And we've also talked about that throughout your career, you're going to be writing IEP goals. But there's another reason why we're writing IEP goals. In addition to the fact that we want you to be able to develop those competencies that we talked about in your IDEA goals, but we're talking about now, we're going to talk about a different IDEA, and that is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And remember, that is the law related to students with disabilities and their education and their right to a free, appropriate education, or FAPE. So the IDEA states that every student who receives special education has to have an IEP, and that IEP must have a statement of measurable annual goals. And so not only is this going to be a part of your program and an important part of your career, but this is a legal requirement of your job. So an IEP is a legally binding document. It is a legal agreement between a school district and a parent, and you are legally held and bound by that IEP. So that's another reason why it's important that you learn this, is because it is a legal part of your job. And so when you're writing those IEP goals, you're going to make sure according to IDEA, you have to address both academic skills, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about in this class. But for students who require it, you're also going to be writing functional goals. And so those might be things like daily living skills. It could be something like brushing your teeth. It could be taking the bus. But I want to also let you know that you also could have IEP goals related to students' other educational needs. For example, if a student gets occupational therapy, there may be IEP goals related to that. If a student gets physical therapy, if a student has deficits related to behavior or social skills, communication, you could have IEP goals related to those as well, because your goals are written as and are directly addressing your students' needs as it relates to their disability. So, just to remind you of the six components of an IEP goal. Now, remember, this is an overview. Right now, we are just building prior knowledge for you. I'm going to be sharing this over and over again because we want you to have some of that knowledge in there so that when we start doing these deep dives into each of the components, you are able to make those connections with your prior knowledge. You are welcome to stop the video and read through each of these component examples, but for right now, we're just going to go straight through them again to help you start to build your knowledge related to IEP goals. So every IEP is going to have a condition. That's the circumstances under which the behavior is going to be demonstrated. You got to have that student. We got to know who the IEP is written for, who's going to do the learning. Then you're going to have the behavior, and that is the specific skill you're going to be teaching. Now, I want you to hear this one because I want you to always remember that your criterion, or that level of mastery, how you know that student's going to has mastered that goal, always has two parts. The criterion always has two parts. And so the first part is that level of performance, and that performance, that mastery criterion, has to be demonstrated across time. All right. We don't just demonstrate it once, we demonstrate it across time. Speaking of time, every IEP goal is going to have a timeline. That is the time by which we anticipate the student is going to achieve that skill. And then finally, you're going to have your evaluation measure or procedure, because that you always have to know, how am I going to measure the student's progress? What method or what tool am I going to use to do that? So again, you're welcome to look at those examples. We will look at them later in our course. This week, we are going to be talking about the condition, but before we do that, I want to remind you that when you write your IEP goals, we have a template that you are going to use initially to ensure that you have all components of an IEP goal. That is a requirement. As you become proficient, as I said before, you can then kind of vary off from this a little bit. And I wanted to give you some examples of different ways you can write conditions. So this week, they're not all going to start with given, but they could all start with given, and you'll see that in a few minutes. All right, to let you know what you have coming up, this is part of that explicit instruction we're doing right now, as I am preparing you by giving you a preview of what you're going to be doing in class in our next lesson. So once we are in class, we're going to be doing something called a conditions challenge. Now, there is one mistake on this slide. We are not going to do that last one on circumstances. But what you're going to do is you are going to work with someone else, and you are going to write two conditions under each of the types of conditions that we're going to go over today, because there are different types of conditions that go with different types of behaviors, and you have to make sure that your condition and your behavior align with one another. So the first type of condition is related to materials or measures. And really, what is the purpose of that? It's exactly what it sounds like. It tells us what materials or what measure the student is going to be using when they demonstrate the behavior. So I want you to think about these and think about them as materials or measures as I give you examples. So one is given a worksheet with 20 multiplication problems. The next one is given a grade level passage. So what is the measure we're going to be using? We're going to be using this grade level passage. The next one, using, notice it's not given, but it could be given, using a communication device, and that would be that AAC, augmentative and alternative communication device, and that is a material. Now, again, I wanted to show you some different ways to write conditions. So this one says using a communication device, be absolutely appropriate to put given a communication device. All right. The next thing you're going to do, and we're going to be doing a pattern that's going to be consistent throughout each one of these types of conditions, is the second thing you do after I give you an example is I want you to read a portion of an IEP goal, and I want you to be able to identify the condition in that portion of an IEP goal. So go ahead, stop your video, read these three practice examples, and I want you just in your mind, you don't have to write these down, but in your mind, I want you to identify each of the conditions within them, okay? I'll see you in just a second. Okay, so when we're looking at the examples we have here, your condition in the first one would be the task analysis. Under what conditions would the student clean the counter? Well, when we give them a task analysis, that's a condition under which, and that could be a measure, it could be materials. If I'm giving you the actual task analysis, then that is materials. If I am using the task analysis and we're looking at all of the steps of the task analysis, that could be a measure. The next one is given a graphic organizer. Under which condition are you going to write a paragraph with 3 details? When you're given a graphic organizer, and that graphic organizer would be materials. The next one, given a curriculum-based assessment, the student will read aloud. Under what condition is the student going to read aloud? It's going to be under the measure of a curriculum-based assessment. All right, the next thing you're going to do is for number 12, and again, we're going to do this across all of these different types of conditions. I want you to stop your video, and you can just put you can put condition and materials, and I'll know exactly what you're doing. But what I want you to do is to write 2 conditions that include specific materials. All right, go ahead and write those, and then come back when you're done. I did not point out before I sent you to do number 12 that these have a star in the top. And again, the reason that I have that is because you want to make sure that you remember each of these different types of conditions because they will come in handy later on. Because remember, you have to make sure your behavior and condition align with one another. All right, let's look at the next condition. The next condition is setting. Now, I want to talk to you about the setting because the setting is a pretty special is a component, and when we're thinking about the condition, or it's a special condition. Um, you only write the setting as part of your condition if the student does not currently demonstrate the behavior in that setting, but they're demonstrating it in another setting. Here's an example. A student is able to answer comprehension questions orally when they are working one-on-one with me. When we are working one-on-one, that is a setting, one-on-one in a one-on-one instructional setting. The student is able to do it with me. But then when we move to a small group, the student cannot answer comprehension questions. They are not generalizing to this different setting. Okay, so you can see they can do it in one setting, they can't do it in this setting. And so it's important that we specify that that's where we want the behavior to be demonstrated. And so here's an example during small group instruction. If the student is not currently doing it in small group instruction, we would use that condition. But if they always do this in small group instruction, for example, they always are able to do addition in small group instruction, but we just want them to increase their correct responses to addition equations. We want them to move from 80% to 100%. We're not going to put small group. That's where they're always doing it. That's where they always do it. So only do you put the setting as a condition if they are not currently able to do it in that setting. The next one could be in the cafeteria during lunch. The student is using their communication device in the self-contained classroom. They are not yet doing it outside the classroom. And the first place we're going to start with them using that communication device outside of the classroom is in the cafeteria. Or it may be the student, you want them to be able to do it across school settings because they're currently able to do it in our classroom, but they're not able to do it once they walk out. So really what you're looking at are generalizing these skills to new settings. So again, go ahead and stop your video, see if you can identify the conditions in these portions of an IEP, and then come back. And as I said before, the next thing that you're going to do, actually, we could go ahead and do that now. There's no need you could do those both at the same time. So the first one is to identify the condition in your head. You don't have to come back. And then I want you to write those two goals, okay? All right, now that you've come back, let's go ahead and look at identifying those conditions. I think it's pretty easy because in the ones I'm sharing with you, the condition is at the beginning of the goal, which is where it's typically located. So the first one is, what setting do we want the student to initiate conversations with peers in the 10th grade classroom? Where do we want the student to follow the group routine? During morning routine, because they're not doing it in morning routine right now. They're not doing it in the 10th grade classroom. Where do we want our student to line up when the bell rings? On the playground. That's an important one because for those of you who teach younger children, there's going to be a student you have in your career who does not line up when the bell rings. All right, I'm excited to see the two conditions that you wrote on your own. Let's look at the next one. All right, for the next condition, it's called the amount of assistance. And for those of you in birth to 5, for those of you who are working with students with complex support needs, there are many times that you are going to write IEP goals with conditions. And that really is just with the amount of assistance. And really what that is, it just tells how much of support, the amount of support the student will receive in order to correctly demonstrate or perform the skill. And the reason that we use the amount of assistance is because the student is not currently demonstrating this skill independently. And we don't anticipate they're going to demonstrate it independently within the life of the IEP, for example. So this could be an IEP goal. What we want them to do, or an objective, it could be that we want them over the year to be able to learn it, to do it independently. But right now, for the objective, we first want them to start with support, and we're going to slowly fade that support out. So it might be that the student can't do it independently, but what we want them to be able to do is to be able to perform the skill correctly when we give them verbal prompts. Can't do it by yourself independently yet, but we want you to be able to do it with verbal prompts, because perhaps before we were giving you full physical assistance and now we're fading it to less assistance. So the next one could be with physical guidance. That can be high. That's a high level of support. So right now you can't do it independently. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide you with physical assistance, some kind of physical guidance. And then once you're able to perform it with physical guidance, we're going to fade that. And perhaps we're going to fade it to a visual cue. And then finally, independently, that can be an amount of assistance because it's no assistance. And you would put that when in the past the student has required assistance, and we're fading that out to independence. So again, as I said before, what I want you to do now is with the first one to see if you can identify the condition, read those to yourself, and then write two conditions related to the amount of assistance and come back and join me. All right, so when we're looking at the amount of assistance, then the first one, it's given a peer model. A peer model, if the peer is modeling it, that is a type of support. That is a type of assistance. Given no more than two verbal prompts, the student will begin the assignment. So right now, it may be that we're having to physically guide, to physically support the student, or we're giving them, hopefully you're never given more than two verbal prompts. If so, you need to move to something different. But maybe for right now, again, you're having to physically support the student in moving, maybe giving them some partial physical assistance, and we want them to move down to no more than two verbal prompts. And then again, finally, independently. All right, I look forward to seeing your condition statements related to the level of assistance or support a student might need. Let's look at the next one. The next type of condition is timing. Timing. And that tells us when the behavior occurs. So sometimes it could be an amount of time, or sometimes it could be related. Let's look at it because it'll be a little bit easier for you to understand. So when we're looking at the amount of time, it could be within 5 seconds of being asked. So typically we ask the student to get off, that it's time to turn off the computer. And we want them, right now it is taking them, they are having some behavioral challenges, and those behavioral challenges are lasting for 10 minutes. And we want that to move down where we don't have the behavioral challenges, but it may be they need to take a break because they've become frustrated. And so within 5 minutes of being asked, we want them to come away from break and come back and join the group and do whatever it is we're asking them. Now, this is the reason why I wanted to tell you that it's not always time like 5 minutes, because it could be something like after reading a passage aloud. And that because it does still tell us when. When is the student going to answer those comprehension questions? After after I read a passage aloud. So it still tells you when. It still is related to timing, but it's not an actual time. And then the last one is when transitioning between classes, because that is a time. When do we want it to happen? We want it to happen when it is between classes. For example, we want, when transitioning between classes, we want the student to go from one location to the next without detouring, without, stopping and engaging in extended conversations with peers. All right, just as you've done with the other condition types, I want you to first identify the condition within the portion of the IEP goal, and then I want you to write two conditions that specify timing, and then come back and join me. Okay, so we have learned all about the different types of conditions. Check in with yourself, check your understanding. How are you feeling about conditions so far? If you have any questions, anything you don't understand, make sure you add them to your participation document, and I will see you all in class.